The main purpose of the boss battle is to provide a change of pace and reward the player for making it this far. Regardless of the difficulty, the boss battle is all about giving us a break from the norm, whether it's exploring spooky dungeons or stealthily sneaking about, and allowing us to take on a new challenge. Nobody plays a game and thinks, oh, I better take care of these boss battles so that I'm ready for the minions. We spend the entire game preparing for them and heading specifically in their direction. They provide a chance for us to show off what we've learned. Now this is all well and good, but a break from the norm is all for naught if the boss isn't interesting in its own right. So that begs the question, what makes a good boss battle? For a boss battle to be effective, it must be proficient in at least one of the two following areas. It either has to be an effective test of skill that ensures that we can utilise all we've learned so far to meet a new challenge, or it has to be a puzzle that you are asked to solve in order to beat an otherwise unbeatable enemy. There's also a third element, but we'll come back to that in a moment. If I were to create a chart like this, with skill on one side and problem solving on the other, you'll find that all of your favourite bosses fit in here somewhere. For example, Dark Souls is all about taking everything you've learned thus far in regards to combating enemies and defeating a daunting foe with it, with very little in the way of problem solving needed. Other examples include boss fights in Bayonetta and the final fight with the Rebel flagship in FTL. On the other end of the spectrum, you have a game like Shadow of the Colossus, which requires less skill but much more problem solving as you try to discover the most effective way to scale these bosses and deliver the killing blow. Other bosses include the fight with GLaDOS in Portal, or the final boss fight in Max Payne. If a boss fight falls in this area, with little skill or problem solving required to accomplish it, there is still a way to make it satisfying, which is where the third aspect comes into play. Storied boss fights, where the sequence is more a way to push forward the narrative or define a character than it is to provide a challenge. This has become far more common recently, for reasons I'll get into later, with it appearing in certain games like Mass Effect 3, Jedi Outcast, which I've already discussed at length in another video, and one of my personal favourites, the ending of Batman Arkham Origins, where you fight with the Joker. On the surface, this sequence is about defeating a bad guy and saving the day, but on a deeper level, it also goes a long way to implying the sadomasochist, borderline sexual relationship that Batman and the Joker have.
Isn't it? You like the way it feels. It's what you need.
You could make the argument that these aren't actually boss fights, but then we get into a deeper discussion of what a boss fight is and where the line should be drawn in mini-bosses and actual bosses and health bars and difficulties, and that's a tale for another time. A large part of what makes a great boss battle doesn't actually have anything to do with the fight at all, but what comes before. The anticipation of an upcoming boss is just as important, if not more so. It's like foreplay. You keep teasing the player and keeping them on edge for what is about to come. Maybe people keep talking about this powerful entity that's pulling all the strings from behind the shadows, or you have a short cutscene or transition which you identify with a boss stage. This is something that Dark Souls absolutely nails, as if you weren't tense enough during every moment of this game. Every time you see one of those gates of fog, your anxiety builds up a little. There may be a boss waiting for you. Then again, there may not. It's up to you to decide whether to pass through or not. Although, before even teasing the boss, you should first be looking at the core gameplay. What do you do outside of boss battles throughout the main game? How does combat work? Let's have a look at the boss fights in the Batman Arkham series to show you what I mean. Batman Arkham Asylum had a rather groundbreaking combat system, where it's less about taking combatants on one at a time, and more about fighting several thugs at once. There's a great rhythm that comes with every fight, almost like a dance. It was great power fantasy gameplay which is still being copied to this day, but it didn't translate well over to the boss battles as the combat system was built from the ground up to accommodate groups, not single enemies. As such, most of the bosses in Arkham Asylum are either simple puzzles, mere cutscenes, or the biggest culprit, are just the same waves of enemies we've been fighting for the entire game. Now, minion boss battles in and of themselves aren't necessarily a bad thing. If you're fighting a unique boss with minions at the same time, it's a decent way to change things up. Or in a game where you control multiple characters like in Dragon Age, they provide an interesting dynamic as you have to plan the battles around them. If you're going to use them, do so in a way that is different from the rest of the game. Sometimes they provide buffs to the boss, like in Jedi Academy or the Final Fantasy games, where taking them out makes the boss weaker. They can also be a welcome sight if they provide health drops, like in Metroid Prime or God of War. Speaking of God of War, the opening boss battles used in all 3 games are known as scrolling boss battles, in that they all take place in multiple locations and keeps the player moving, so providing a bunch of foot soldiers in between the big encounters helps provide an exciting dynamic and is great for pacing. Fighting waves of the same enemies in the same circled arena, however, is not exciting, it's just plain boring. Making an effective boss battle using combat was always going to be tricky for the Arkham series, so for the Mr. Freeze fight in Arkham City, they flipped the script and made it all about stealth instead. This is also an example of both skill and problem solving working hand in hand, as after you attack him one way, he'll change the environment to ensure that you can't use that trick again. You constantly have to be on your feet, thinking of which tactics to deploy and equipment to bring out. You're using problem solving to find out weaknesses, then skills to exploit them. Despite being seen as the weakest of the series, it wasn't until Arkham Origins before combat was used effectively in boss battles, namely in the fight against Deathstroke, where you have to use the typical combat system, but against a far tougher opponent. Even the other hand-to-hand boss fights were satisfying, proving that games revolving around power fantasy gameplay can still be interesting boss fights, a lesson that Far Cry and Shadow of Mordor would do well to learn. If a boss is sitting in this area and there isn't a story reason for it, then something has gone wrong. Take this boss fight from the otherwise superb Super Meat Boy. It is impossible to enter this fight with a fresh mind and win in the first few tries. Your only option is to memorise the pattern before each death. We're not being asked to solve a problem or practice our skills, which is why people dislike this boss so much. This isn't to say that trial and error gameplay can't work. That's essentially what Punch-Out is. But the major difference is that while learning the patterns and routines of your opponents is definitely helpful, your dodging skills and reflexes are more important. There's a fine line between learning from each fight and simply being asked to remember a pattern. Let's stay with Punch-Out for a moment. Look at how this frame is set up. No matter who you're fighting, they always appear bigger than you, helping them look like daunting foes that are difficult and rewarding to take out. Well, for the most part. A sense of scale is important in boss fights, especially against large ones. It helps hammer home the fact that the player's in over their head. This is mostly accomplished through camera placement, which can make a fairly massive difference. Place it too high, and you make the supposed threatening foe look far less imposing and frankly kind of goofy. Place it too low, and you definitely solved the scale issue, though you have now replaced it with a depth issue, as without being able to see the ground, it becomes harder to tell how far away the boss is. Unless you have a good reason not to, you should always emphasise the player's disadvantage. You are entering their world, not the other way around. Whether they are smarter or stronger than you, they have the upper hand, and it's up to the player to take it away from them, which will make the victory all the sweeter. This is one aspect that is absolutely nailed in Metal Gear Solid. If you confront a gun expert, then you have a gunfight with them. A deadly sharpshooter, a sniper fight. A bomb expert, you get the point. Despite these fights all being so different, you're still making use of the same skills you have acquired throughout the entire game. That, in a nutshell, is what every boss battle should be. The same, but different. The same gameplay, but different challenges. As technology improves, so does the cost of making games. Unfortunately, this means that boss battles are becoming much less appealing to game designers. So much time is spent making the graphics and animations look so great, that spending time on one level, that is different from the rest of the game and will only be used once, is something that companies are less willing to spend resources on. As such, it appears that boss battles are being labelled as dated and being replaced with storied boss battles, which are by no means a bad thing. They can be very memorable when used right, but they don't serve as an effective replacement to the real thing. Vaas from Far Cry 3 is one of my favourite bad guys of all time, yet his death scene is kind of terrible. Same goes for Yuma in Far Cry 4, where after fighting a wave of typical enemies, you awake from your hallucination to just find her dead on the ground. Boss battles aren't vital for every game out there, but challenges that test the player and provide much needed variety are. Otherwise, we're just going to be stuck with things like this. And this. And this.